Well, I was talking to Fred some time ago and about setting up for tonight's program, and I realized I'd made a bad mistake. You don't want to follow Jeremy Rowe when you're talking about the history of photography. So this is going to be a different kind of talk. But I want to point out one word in my title, and that is the first word there. This is my own take on the history of fine art photography in Arizona. But I do want to start in the 19th century. This is Carlton Watkins, large format of what we now call a Puncha fulgida, a chain fruit cholla. I just wanted to sort of ground the first part of this talk in a distinction between visitors and residents, and also sort of a gauge of early Arizona photographers' interest in different subjects. And the landscape is a perennial subject. Ethnographic work is really important early on, too. This is Carlton Watkins. I don't know exactly the date. My research was a little haphazard. But speaking of staffage, there he is. So you can tell how large it is. There's a really early O'Sullivan, probably the first photograph of a saguaro. There's a figure in there, but he's almost impossible to see. I mean, I looked at that picture for a long time before I even saw him. So he is providing some scale, but he's doing it very discreetly. This is an O'Sullivan. O'Sullivan's an interesting person and a kind of precursor and a touchstone for fine art photographers, I think. And then you see some staffage here too, in the form of the coffee cup and maybe the beer bottle. Mark Klett would like to know where this picture is taken. And if he used to say, kind of broadly joking that, it would be worth a lot to him to find this rock. So keep your eyes out if you're over by the Colorado. This is a Hillers of Walpi. And just, interest in Native American culture was really important. And I'm kind of looking for antecedents for fine art photography, looking for touchstones, things that people will return to. William Henry Jackson, photographing in the Grand Canyon. A guy's looking out, I don't know if you can see it, but he's looking out across the canyon with a telescope, and it's just a beautiful image. This is an Edward Curtis, taken, I'm going to say 15 miles from here. I had this I owned this print for a while. I sold it. Things passed through hands. But I think that might be South Mountain from the south. I never really got exactly to the camera position, but I kind of think it is. And these women are saguaro fruit gatherers, but of course Curtis is there in a time other than the saguaro fruiting time. And so there's no fruit on those saguaros. They did a really thorough job. They're also barefoot, which is kind of remarkable. This is a Vroman he was from Pasadena, bookseller, very good photographer, spent a lot of time in Arizona and the Southwest in general. And this is, I think, the one repeated image in our lecture. But C.S. Fly, you could argue, is a very early resident of Arizona. He really put down roots here and operated from a home base, as opposed to a lot of the people who came, Curtis, Hillers. Hillers stayed some time, but people were passing through earlier, and then at a certain point, and this happens all over the world whenever photography comes into the picture, so to speak, people are first visitors and then residents. And I'm kind of interested in talking about the residents, and so I think of him as someone who operated from a sense of being an Arizonan. This is the studio, and then of course the studio on fire, taken by his widow, Molly Fly. This is a Henry Buman of Tucson, and Buman again was I think a proud Tucsonan, I think it's fair to say, and an important person in addition to photography. He was a well-known figure in the community. So I just want to run through the decades. We're kind of up to the 1920s now. Population of Arizona is 344,000 in like 1920. This is my nomination for the first fine art photographer of Arizona, Foreman Hanna. And I brought my own Foreman Hanna. I wanted to offer him an honorary membership in the members exhibit here. But I think that he was, like a lot of photographers, had a day job. He was a pharmacist in Globe. But he was very involved in fine art photography and connected to New York and exhibits there. He had some ambitions for his work. I think people in Globe were quite proud of the fact that his photographs were being exhibited elsewhere. And he's a remarkably good photographer. And there's just no denying that this photograph was made with an aesthetic agenda. And there's a lot. His work is kind of heavy toward these sort of desert nymphs, very pictorialist. There's a lot of those. But I think his landscapes are just amazing, and they feel quite contemporary, some of them. I'd be happy to argue with anybody, but this is my sense of the first really fine art photographer in Arizona. And that takes us to the 1930s. The population now 435,000. I wanted to just touch on Laura Gilpin. She's a little bit out of sequence, but she had such a long career that you could place images by her in many decades. That picture of her taking a picture is from 1971. But there's an aesthetic, but also that kind of touchstone of, there's a landscape aesthetic, but there's a touchstone of ethnographic work. And I think that she spent a lot of time with the Navajo and really ingratiated herself. And I think she maybe had more success in that because she was a woman, frankly, and maybe less threatening than other people. But she was a very serious photographer for many decades. And then there's Frederick Sommer, and I wish you could see what's on my screen rather than what's up there, and I wish you could see an actual print because they're amazing. But sometimes the world produces a genius, and there's no doubt in my mind that Frederick Sommer qualifies for that. He comes out of nowhere. But the reason he came to Arizona was because of tuberculosis. And this is a story that is, I don't know if there's a history of it, but many, many people came here with tuberculosis. And it brought a lot of people who were important people, accomplished people in other realms and other places. And they brought them to Arizona, and we really benefited as a state from that influx of people who could literally breathe easier here. And Frederick Sommer was one. I saw some indication that Henry Buehlmann might be another. They don't think they really diagnosed him with tuberculosis, but I saw some indication that he too found it easier to live here. I'm not going to go through these pictures. I've held many Frederick Sommers in my hands, and they are astonishing objects. And you really can't. This is better than that, and the prints are amazing. So if you can get yourself in front of one, it's really worth doing. This is Max Ernst, a very internationally famous artist, surrealist, and who found it important to come and visit Frederick Sommer and learn from him. And many people did. Aaron Siskin, Emmett Gowan had really long, productive, and Edward Weston too, long, productive relationships with Frederick Sommer. there was just nobody else like him, you know, in the history of photography, but certainly not in Arizona. And he lived very modestly in Prescott. 1940s, just shy of 500,000 people in Arizona. And I wanted to touch on Arizona highways, not because it comes from a strictly fine art tradition. When I was in grad school, and since, the Arizona highways is kind of a pejorative. But it was masterful in producing this iconography that other people would be inspired by to come visit Arizona. So there's, and then eventually they produced a book of Joseph Munch's work. It's very kind of a Disneyland view of Arizona in my view, but it was really an important thing, and I wanted to kind of highlight how Arizona was becoming known as a destination and someplace that a fine art photographer could expect to find something interesting to take pictures of. 1950s were 749,000, and this is an example. This is Edward Weston taken in Papago Park, not that far from the rockologist place and the guide. And this is probably, I'm guessing, but 1937 would be my guess, on the Guggenheim trip. Hole in the rock in the background. And then this is Ansel Adams. I made up the title, just to be clear. Just a descriptive title. That's not his title. But I wanted just to show you that people were starting to think about Arizona in terms of a place where they could go to make especially landscape and ethnographic pictures. 1960s, we have 1.3 million people. And this is Alan Dutton, who led a program at Phoenix College, starting in the 60s into the 70s. And just we have at least one student of his here in the audience, and he was very important. I mean, I talked to Terry Etherton, the photography dealer in Tucson, and he came up and appraised the collection at Phoenix College, and it was just remarkable. It had Winograns and Friedlanders, and for a while, it was the oasis on your way from, say, Houston to LA. If you're a photographer making your way across the country, stop in, talk to Alan, give a talk, and a lot of those photographers have donated or had pictures purchased. Alan is a complete crazy man. This is one of his pre-Photoshop collages. This is a desert explosion. He obviously was a man who had a good time and was, didn't take himself very seriously, I think, but he was a very important person. I just wanted to say one aside, just is that I was doing a little AI research on this, and I typed in Dutton and Phoenix College, and just to get some dates or something, and it started. It responded by saying, Richard Dick Dutton. I'm like, you're hallucinating. I just made up that name, and it was very authoritative. It was like, no, I'm not going to rely on anything. 1970s, huge decade for fine art photography in Arizona. We have now 1.7 million people. Talking about Jack Stuhler, Jack actually. So now we're talking about people I actually knew. I didn't know Alan Dutton. I'm sorry to say I didn't know Fred Summer, but Jack Stuhler was a professor of mine at ASU. He had gotten an MFA, I think must have been the first MFA in photography in Arizona in like do you know, Neil, 64 or something like that?
In that area.
Yeah, and then he promptly started the program at ASU. This is kind of an interesting book because it's not only Jack's first and perhaps only book, but it's also the first book that an Israeli press published. And Chris Pickler was a student of Jack's and went on to produce many, many, many books at an Israeli press and continues to this day. Just a quick page spread from the book, and you can see he's very much in the mode of Minor White, Aaron Siskin, and those kinds of photographers. But Jack was a remarkably hardworking photographer. He was really a role model for a lot of us. He was just, and I can tell you from many, many cranky comments he made, that he was sort of promised, like, look, Fridays are a research day. That's when I do my photography, and other times too, but Fridays are sacred. and the university kind of wanted to fudge on that a little bit, and he was not having any of it. But there was also a moment, well, I'll come back to that. This is Van Daren Koch, who also was instrumental in starting the ASU photography program that I went through, and he was a real scholar of photography. And for a long time, he went from here to being, among other things, the director of the University Art Museum in New Mexico, but also the director of SF MoMA, where he played a role as kind of the anti-Sarkowski, where he would champion people like Joel Peter Witkin, which Sarkowski wasn't interested in at all, I don't think. And it's amazing to think that there's this kind of coastal duality, because there are so many curators and so much work being done. But Van was one of the people you saw if you were interested in making pictures that Museum of Modern Art wouldn't be interested in at a certain time. And you can see that evidence in his own photography. So the program also produces Northlight Gallery. And starting, I think, with maybe Neil in 72 or 73?
72, yeah.
Yeah, 72. Yeah, and yeah, this is at the bottom of Matthews Hall, and I can look at this photograph and I can practically smell what that gallery smelled like. This is my own documentation of my own show there. Sorry for the self-promotion, but I photographed that cactus 2 days ago for the 95th time, I think. But yeah, this was a show I had in 2007. But just walking into that gallery, stepping down those carpeted steps and smelling and seeing your friends. And I'm quite confident at the end of my life I will have seen more shows in that space than any other space I've ever seen shows in. I mean, as a student, I went to every show. And I remember a show in September, and it was Kelly Kirkpatrick, Vivian Spiegelman, and do you remember this show? One other? Anyway, I remember talking to Mark Klett about the fact that I had seen an occultation of Saturn, the moon moving in front of Saturn. That morning, I got up early to see it. The next day, 2 airplanes flew into the World Trade Center, and the world was a changed place. But that was a really great space and really important. I just really kind of love these exhibition spaces, and they're constantly changing. And speaking of that, in 1975, this is John Schaefer on the left and Ansel Adams on the right, and they conspired to create the Center for Creative Photography. And so Adams was, leading workshops in Yosemite, and Schaefer took a class, and Adams thought, I got a university professor here, captive audience. We're going to make a deal. So they struck up a friendship, and they started the Center for Creative Photography in 1975. This is the first director of the CCP was Harold Jones, who had come from George Eastman House and also light gallery. So he had a gallery background and a kind of an academic background in a MFA from University of New Mexico. Not a great photograph, but that's what I found that was contemporaneous with Harold's directorship. And he also, he left the center as a director relatively quickly and went on to found, just across the way, the U of A's photography program. This is Luis Carlos Bernal, and this is in 1980. He was a MFA from ASU and went on to found the program at Pima Community College in Tucson. There's a very important, Tucson's smaller community, but between the center and Pima, they had a pretty robust fine art photography tradition that they were working on. This is the Luis Carlos Bernal gallery at Pima College, and this is his work and being exhibited there. And you probably know that the Center for Creative Photography has just had a big retrospective of Lou Bernal's work. My wife went to Pima College and took photography classes with Lou, and he said to her, she was 21 years old, maybe, you are very mysterious. And who doesn't want to be told that, And so he had a real charm and a real, gift with students, I think. A lot of his students would say so. He was tragically hit by a car riding his bike home or to and from work, and he was in a coma for many years and eventually passed away. These are two Bills who are important to me, especially the guy on the left, Bill Jenkins, who had come to ASU to teach after his amazing success at George Eastman House as a young curator. And then Bill J. is a world-renowned photo historian and enthusiast. When I went to school there, and of course before and after, Bill J., I sat in on his classes. I had been to U of A and taken classes from Keith McElroy in the history of photography. I think Keith was the most impressive teacher I ever had. But Bill J. was really very charming, and when he gave a lecture in photography, he said, now when I'm behind the podium, you can be tested on this. But when I step away from the podium, I'm just going to tell you a story. And in that tradition, I think I hadn't really planned on this, but there's a story Bill Jenkins told me, and I'm just going to step away. Metaphorically, I can't step away from the microphone, but Bill was saying when he became a curator at the George Eastman House, and thus somebody to kind of conjure with as a photographer, he went to go see two photographers you know very well, and one was Paul Caponegro. And so Bill goes in, and Caponegro insists on playing piano for him. And Bill was just impatient with this, like, let's just talk about photography, I don't need to be put in a mood or hypnotized like this, that's, and he just thought the whole thing was so pretentious. And relatively soon after that, he went and saw Minor White, and Minor White had worked in museums, and White opens the door and looks at Bill and goes, "Are you here because you think I'm going to croak?" And Bill said, "Yep." And well, come on in then, and he just found Minor White charming and down to earth, and Caponegro otherwise. And so that's my Bill J. story. But I think Bill was just looking at that picture of him with the sort of arched eyebrow and the curiosity and the interest in engaging his students. So you couldn't say anything to Bill that wouldn't result in a kind of exclamation of, "That's a good research project." That was what he always said. So anyway, 1980s, we're at 2.8 million. This is Terry Etherton as a young man in his gallery. This is a photograph by Victor Landweber taken in 1985. Terry started his gallery in 81, and he's just the knowledge in Terry's head of where things are and who wants them and what they're worth is just encyclopedic. And I had actually, it's a funny coincidence, I had met Victor Landweber that year in 1985. I was still living in California. But Terry just ran the best gallery, and Tucson summers being what they were, he would often close the gallery, and he loved minor league baseball. So he would put prints in his car, in the trunk of his car, drive around to museums and take in minor league baseball games. That's very Terry Etherton, He really enjoys things. And one thing that makes him a good salesman is he just loves what he is talking about and loves the knowledge of it. This is Terry in his new gallery, taken a few years ago. And then about 1982, Mark Klett moves to Arizona to take a job at Arizona State, originally not on faculty, but working in a kind of photography lab at the service of other visiting artists. And he's been a very important person in my life. But I'm just, in a sense, using him as a reference to a lot of people who are moving to Arizona, moving to the Southwest, and their photographers, or soon will be, and they kind of engage with the landscape. That's Lena at age 7. Mark and Lena were born on the same day, so every year they take a double portrait like this, and they have continued to do that. It's another double portrait of Mark and Lisa Setti at a ArtLink event, as a matter of fact. And I don't know what that was about, but I found a video on Instagram of a pan across Lisa's old gallery space, and I just tried to do a screen grab, but that's apparently a Mark Klett exhibit. I don't know, 1998 or something. And I just loved that old gallery space. It was a bad gallery space in some ways because it had so much windows that there were so many reflections. But these two people have been really just central to my life living here. In 1989, the new Center for Creative Photography building opened, and I'm sure some of you have seen the old building, but it was truly modest. It was an old bank building, and they had the library in there, and they had the archive, and they had exhibition space, and it was just like a tiny little operation compared to what this building, what goes on in this building. We used to study, Liz Allen and another woman and myself used to study for Keith McElroy's very difficult exams in that little meeting room there. And I was putting this thing together, and I thought, well, I kind of participated in some of this later stuff, I've been part of it. I was at the dedication of that building when they first announced that they had the Richard Avedon archive. That was a great night. So now we're at 5.6 million. This is Dr. Rebecca Simpf. And she insists on being called doctor, so you have to do that. But she came here to do a dual curator position with the Phoenix Art Museum and the Center for Creative Photography, and it was Jim Ballinger's idea. So she was hired, and she came up here and promptly and skillfully started a community and a small organization dedicated to photography at the Phoenix Art Museum called In Focus. And I think that you can see in that picture Judy Zuber is one of the people looking at photographs there. I'm trying to decide if that's Mary Statzer in the background, but I don't know. It might not be. But Becky is just a really gifted enthusiast for photography, and can talk to almost anybody about photography, and increased my visitation at Phoenix Art Museum by 10x, I think, to go to every Norton show. I think I've seen every one of them at the Phoenix Art Museum, and it just made a huge difference. This is the Norton Gallery space on the left, and I did want to kind of give a shout out while we're talking about centers of gravity for the community in Arizona, the photography community in Arizona, to Art Intersection. The gallery space, as you all know, has since been closed, but it was a really important gathering place. And I think that's it.